Out of all the experiences we have in life, there are always a few that we really remember. I especially remember my first church, which was in a place called Lake St. John, Louisiana, which is outside of Faraday. And as people used to tell me, I want you to go visit so-and-so. Some of those visits were very interesting. This particular visit was one of those most interesting ones. I went to visit this man. He was in his 40s, and when I came to the door, he invited me in, and he said, "Oh, you're the pastor over at that white church." White building, he meant. It was also a white church, but a white building for sure. And I said, "Yes, I've just been there a short time." And he said, "You mean you're pastoring in this area now? Where are you from?" And I told him I was from Chicago. "Oh, okay, well, that's too bad. You don't really understand this area. Come on over here." And he brought me to a case of guns. And he said, "You cannot possibly pastor in this area without your own gun." And he said, "Pick out one of these guns and you can have it." So I've always remembered that. I did pick out a gun and kept it in my glove compartment. I don't know whether I needed a permit or not, but this man told me to do that. So I did it. And then I found out one of the reasons why he said that. He said, "We only have three businesses here in this community. There are 2 convenience stores that sell bread and milk, and there's one place he called it a honky-tonk," which I had never heard that term before, and I certainly didn't know what it was, but I soon found out, and I also understood why I might need a gun. Those are some of the experiences you remember. There was one experience that I had in a Sunday school class. And there was a gentleman, and I think I've told this story before. His name was Roger. And he raised his hand. He said, "I want to share something with you." I said, "Sure, yeah, share with them." We had a class of maybe 8 or 10 people. He said, "You know what? I've quit reading the Old Testament altogether. I don't want to touch it anymore. I don't want to read it anymore," which was a pretty bold statement. So people looked at him and asked, "Well, why is that, Roger?" "Well, because I found that the God of the Old Testament is a vengeful God of hatred, and the God I read in the New Testament is a God of love. So I'd rather have the God of love. So I'm not going to read any of the Old Testament." Well, the purpose of the message this morning is to look at contrast and also continuity. Now, there's no doubt that there is contrast between the New Testament and the Old Testament. The historical situation is different. After all, the New Testament is called the New Covenant. In another place, it's called the New Wine. And so we know that the New Testament has a newness to share with us, and definitely it does. But surprisingly, to a lot of people, there is a great continuity. And that continuity is the character and actions of God in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, my friend Roger pointed out something that had struck him, and it led him to not read the Old Testament. As far as I know, he never read it for the rest of his life. And by the way, there was a whole group of early Christians, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. I think they maybe went out of existence in the 5th or 6th century, although they have been revived. These people were called the Montanists. And you know what the Montanists believed is, stop reading the Old Testament because it has nothing to offer to the Christian. And they were condemned by the church eventually. But that's exactly the belief they had, which was the belief of Roger. Well, sometimes it's hard to see that continuity. But I'd like us to consider two of the most important words in the Bible. The first word I'd like to consider is the word pronounced in Hebrew, hesed. Hesed. And it's simply transliterated Hesed. Now, this word appears almost 250 times in the Old Testament. I would say that's pretty significant. Even when something appears once in the Bible, it's significant. But for something to appear 250 times is pretty incredible. That reminds me of the English preacher who decided that he wanted to preach on the shortest verse in the Bible. And of course, that verse is Jesus wept. And the amazing thing about it is he preached on that verse for 12 sermons in a row. Jesus wept. And the sermons are, Jesus wept for you, Jesus wept for us, Jesus wept for the sinner. And it went on through 12 sermons. Well, when you have a word that appears 250 times, it's pretty significant. And that word is hesed in the Old Testament. Now, there are at least two dimensions of this word. There is a vertical dimension and there is a horizontal dimension. The vertical dimension, loving kindness, has to do with God's relationship with His people. And that relationship is characterized again and again, especially in the book of Psalms, as a relationship of loving kindness. Now, I think most of us know that the story of Israel that is told in the Old Testament is one that has peaks, tremendous peaks, like the revival under Josiah, and then it has deep, deep valleys. One of those deep valleys, remember, happened when Moses came back after having an encounter with God, and the people were there dancing, having a drunken party, and building an idol made out of gold and silver. And so you have these great spiritual peaks, and then you have these deep valleys. The interesting thing about the word hesed is many times, even in the valleys, God will emphasize the idea of His loving kindness toward His people. And even in the valleys, He'll challenge the people to come back to Him. That happens again and again and again in the Old Testament. And so the Old Testament is not just a book of harsh condemnation of a God that just waits for you to step out of line so He can destroy you in some way. But you have this continuity with the New Testament of that seeking God who is always trying to draw back His people. And it appears in that word hesed. Out of those 250 times that word appears, there's not only that vertical relationship, God and mankind, but there's also that horizontal relationship, which reminds us exactly of the life and teaching of Jesus. That word hesed is a loving kindness that in the Old Testament, the people of God are instructed to have for one another. That is, they are to have that loving kindness for the entire nation of Israel. But then there are even those verses where they are instructed to have that loving kindness for the foreigner, for the one who doesn't belong to the nation of Israel. And of course, that exactly is what Jesus teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount. So, although it appears maybe to some people that there's a complete contrast between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see that strong continuity where our relationship should be defined by loving kindness. Now, how does this relate to the word charis, which is the second great word of the New Testament? And it appears way over 38 times, depending on the translation you look at. But usually, when we translate the word charis from Greek, we generally translate the word grace. Now, sometimes it can also be translated charismatic. And we think of a charismatic person as somebody who is outstanding. You can meet a charismatic person, immediately you're attracted to that individual because of the qualities he or she exudes. And one of those qualities is the root of charis, which is grace. When you meet somebody who is full of grace and full of mercy and full of understanding, you are immediately attracted to that person, and he's called charismatic, or she is called charismatic. Well, you can see immediately that the Greek word charis is a direct corollary with that word hesed, appearing almost 250 times in the Old Testament. It's the loving kindness of God toward His people without respect to their merit. Now, a lot of times we can understand if somebody is our friend, if somebody does something for us, we are more likely to be their friend. We are more likely to do something for them. We have a saying, colloquialism in English, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. In other words, if you do good to me, I'm going to do good to you. But that's not the teaching of Jesus Christ. It's a much more difficult teaching. The teaching is love your enemies. Love those who even spitefully use you, which is a direct correlation to the idea of Hesed in the Old Testament. The loving kindness of God is experienced in that concept we call grace, because it is not based on our merit. If it were based on our merit, it would mean that God loved different people in a different way according to their behavior. So if their behavior is good, God would love them even more. And if their behavior was reprehensible, then God would turn his back on that individual. Thank the Lord that both in the Old Testament and in the New, we are introduced to a God who loves us, cares for us, watches over us as a father does his children. Yes, when the times are good, as they say in Las Vegas, when the good times are rolling, and also when the times are not so good, we still can count on the fatherhood and the care of God in our lives. Most of us come upon hard times. And when we do, sometimes we wonder, God, where are you? And that's okay to wonder that. We may not feel the close presence of God in our lives for a temporary season. But the Bible teaches us in the Old with Hesed and in the New with Charis, grace, that God is not silent. He is always there, walking with us, walking beside us. Yes, when the sun is shining, and also when things are dire and circumstances are not that good. Why is that? Because God's character is the character of love, is the character of extending to his creatures this unbelievable love and care that we all know exists in our lives. Now, the conclusion is this. Although there is a great deal of difference between things in the Old Testament and many things that happen in the New Testament, there is a great contrast. There's no question about that. Roger was right to see a contrast. But even more than that, when we look at a God who reveals himself to his people in the Old as well as the New, we see this character of his love always reaching out to us, his people. I don't know about you, but I need that love. I need that assurance. I need to know that there is a God who cares for me, not only in the good times, but also in those most difficult times. So the conclusion is you can count on God. You don't need to worry about Him abandoning you. You don't need to worry about all of a sudden you waking up some morning and God is gone and all is lost, because throughout the Bible, the 39 books of the Old Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, there is a God of constancy. He neither changes nor is wayward in His love for us. And so now, in the good times and now in the bad, we can trust in a God who always loves us and cares for His children. Amen.